Our channel shares stories that actually happened. Do you know or have experienced any shocking stories? We also tell the stories of our subscribers. Leave them in the comments so we can share them with the world. We want to hear from you. He never imagined that a simple day of work would change the course of his life forever. Working as a gardener at the sprawling mansion of a wealthy family, he had gotten used to the quiet routine of tending the vast gardens. Over the months, he had met many people, seen many things, but never did he expect that today, of all days, he would come face to face with a reality that would shake him to his core. It had been an overcast morning, the air thick with the smell of damp earth as he trimmed bushes and rearranged flowers in the garden. The rhythmic snip of his shears was his only company. As he worked, his mind wandered through the usual thoughts, but something about this morning felt off. That's when he noticed her. A small girl, no more than 7 or 8, peeking out from behind the large window in the mansion's kitchen. She was watching him, her eyes wide and full of curiosity, but there was something unsettling about her stare. He couldn't help but notice that she wasn't like the others in the family, and he had never seen her play outside. The family was known for being very private, so he never thought much of it, but the way she looked at him stirred something in him. The girl was always inside the house, and no one ever seemed to speak about her. It was as if she was a part of the mansion, but not truly a part of the life inside it. Over the next few days, he kept seeing her behind the windows, but never outside, and it only deepened his curiosity. He had never been one to pry, but he began to wonder if something was wrong. Was she sick? Was she being kept inside for a reason? That's when he made up his mind to speak with her. He didn't know why, but he felt a strange compulsion, like he was meant to understand what was going on with this little girl. He knew he had to do something about it. The moment he spoke to her, everything changed. She had been standing in the kitchen window again, staring out with that same vacant expression. This time he waved at her, and to his surprise, she waved back, though her movements were slow and hesitant. He decided it was now or never, so he walked up to the window, hoping to strike up a casual conversation. The girl looked up at him, but she didn't smile. Instead, she spoke in a quiet voice that was barely audible through the glass. "I'm not allowed to go outside," she said, almost as if she were stating a simple fact, not a painful truth. There was a sadness in her voice that struck him immediately. He tried to keep his tone light, asking her why she wasn't allowed to play in the garden, but she didn't answer. Instead, she just looked away as if she were waiting for him to leave. He felt a lump form in his throat. Something didn't sit right. He knew there was more to the story, but he wasn't sure what. As he turned to walk back to his work, his mind raced with questions. Why was she so isolated? Who would keep a child inside all the time, especially with such a large garden at her disposal? His curiosity soon turned to concern, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something was terribly wrong. Later that afternoon, as he trimmed the hedges near the house, he saw the girl again. Only this time she wasn't standing behind the window. She was sitting by the door, staring at the floor with her hands folded in her lap. The sight of her so motionless, so withdrawn, was unsettling. It was clear that she wasn't just a shy, introverted child. There was something deeper at play here. It was as if she had given up on life outside her small world, confined to the walls of the mansion. Something in him snapped. He couldn't just keep working pretending he hadn't noticed. He knew he had to do something. But what? And how? It was when he saw her again just a few hours later that he finally understood the gravity of the situation. He had been working steadily, trying to focus on the task at hand, when he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around expecting to see one of the house staff, but instead there she was. The little girl, her face pale and drawn, standing by the back door, staring at him with an intensity that made his heart race. She wasn't wearing the beanie he had seen her in before, and her head was completely bald. The sight hit him like a punch to the stomach. He knew that look. He had seen it before, in his own daughter's eyes, years ago, when she was fighting for her life against cancer. The memory of his own child, the way she had lost her hair during her chemotherapy treatments, flooded his mind in an instant. He could feel the familiar ache in his chest, the tightness in his throat, as he stared at her. His first instinct was to rush over and comfort her, but something in her expression stopped him. There was no joy in her eyes, no life, just emptiness and fear. She looked so fragile, so broken. His mind began to race. Why was she alone? Why wasn't she getting the care she needed? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a case of isolation. This was neglect. He could see it now in every detail: her frailty, her inability to even look at him with any semblance of hope. This child wasn't just being kept inside. She was being held prisoner by her own circumstances, and the person responsible was her stepfather, the man who had hired him to tend to the grounds. He had never suspected a thing about Chris Hale, the wealthy man who owned the mansion, but now everything about his behavior felt wrong. He had been kind to Dan, always polite and offering drinks or lunch, but Dan now realized that behind that politeness, there was something darker at play. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he knew he couldn't stand by any longer. It was as if a switch had flipped in his mind. His daughter's memory, the years of pain and suffering he had gone through, made him feel an undeniable pull to act. He couldn't sit idly by and let this girl endure the same fate. The thought of a child suffering in silence without anyone to protect her triggered something deep within him. His own experiences with loss, with the pain of watching a loved one wither away in front of him, gave him the strength to take action, even if it meant risking everything. He decided he would confront Chris, or at the very least find out what was really happening with Josalind. He wasn't sure how to approach it, but he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know the truth. Later that day, Dan found himself standing by the back gate of the mansion, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do next. He had seen too much to simply walk away, but he also knew that confronting Chris Hale would be risky. The man was powerful, wealthy, and capable of making problems disappear with a snap of his fingers. Dan had always admired Chris from a distance, believing him to be a kind, generous employer. The way he treated Dan with respect, offering him extra breaks or meals, seemed like the behavior of someone who genuinely cared about his staff. But now, with everything he had seen and heard, Dan realized that kindness could easily be a facade, a way to distract from something far darker. As Dan worked around the mansion, he found his thoughts constantly drifting back to Josalind, the sick girl who had been trapped inside the mansion for so long. Her eyes, empty and sad, haunted him. The feeling of helplessness he had experienced when his own daughter had been sick came flooding back. He had spent months in hospitals, watching as his little girl slowly slipped away, unable to do anything to save her. And now, seeing Josalind in a similar state, he couldn't help but feel the same desperate need to act. As he turned a corner of the garden, he saw Chris walking toward him, a casual smile on his face as he approached. The air felt thick with tension as Dan tried to mask his anxiety. He didn't want to accuse the man outright, not without knowing for sure, but the urge to protect Josalind was stronger than his fear. He greeted Chris with a forced smile, trying to keep the conversation light, but the worry and concern for the little girl who had been locked away inside weighed heavily on him. They exchanged pleasantries, but Dan's mind was far from the small talk. His heart was pounding in his chest as he glanced toward the mansion, wondering where Josalind was and if she was okay. His thoughts were interrupted when Chris asked if everything was going well with the garden. Dan nodded, trying to appear calm, but inside his mind was racing. The conversation felt like a distraction, a way to keep Dan from asking any real questions. He needed to know what was going on with Josalind, and he needed to act fast. The thought of her suffering in silence while her stepfather turned a blind eye made him feel sick to his stomach. But as the conversation continued, Dan realized that confronting Chris directly might not be the best course of action. The man was too controlled, too calculating. If Dan pushed too hard, he could easily find himself out of a job, or worse, be silenced. Yet despite the fear gnawing at him, he knew he couldn't just stand by. He had to find a way to help Josalind, even if it meant putting everything on the line. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He had spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to Josalind. The image of her pale face, Her empty stare and the faint signs of illness were etched into his memory. He could still feel the weight of her gaze as if she was silently begging for help. It was clear to him now that something was terribly wrong, and he couldn't just wait around for someone else to take action. The more he thought about it, the more his decision became clear. He had to do something. He couldn't live with himself knowing that a little girl was suffering and no one was doing anything about it. His heart was heavy with the realization that he might be the only one who could help her. As the rain began to fall in light, steady drops, Dan made up his mind. He couldn't confront Chris directly yet, but he had to find a way to get Josalind out of that house and into the care she so desperately needed. His mind raced as he thought of the best way to approach the situation. He knew that in the end, he would have to take a risk, one that might cost him his job or worse. But what were the alternatives? He couldn't just stand by and let the child suffer. As he worked the last of the overgrown bushes near the front of the house, he noticed Josalind again. She was standing by the large bay window, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were fixed on him as she watched him work, but there was no joy in her gaze. She wasn't playing or moving about, she was just standing there, isolated and alone. It was then that he saw it. She slowly reached up to her head, removed her beanie, and revealed her completely bald scalp. It hit him like a ton of bricks. The realization that she was undergoing chemotherapy, the very same treatments that had stolen his own daughter's hair, was overwhelming. Dan's heart sank as he saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear and pain that had been hidden behind her seemingly lifeless stare. It was like he could feel her pain, just as if it was his own. His daughter, whom he had lost so many years ago, had fought the same battle. He had seen her struggle, the weight of the illness bearing down on her small body, leaving her frail and weak. But she had never had to face it alone. Josalind, on the other hand, was isolated, not just physically but emotionally. It was a cruel, heart-wrenching thing to witness. And it was at that moment that Dan knew he had to act, no matter the consequences. He couldn't sit back any longer. He had to help her. He couldn't allow another child to suffer the way his daughter had. He took a deep breath, wiped his hands on his apron, and made his way to the front of the house, his mind set on what he needed to do next. He couldn't waste any more time. Josalind needed him, and he would find a way to make sure she didn't suffer alone. Dan's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to his van, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He couldn't shake the image of Josalind's bald head, the terror in her eyes and the pain she was clearly enduring without any help. The more he thought about it, the more it became apparent that Chris was more than just a negligent father. He was deliberately withholding care, perhaps in hopes that his stepdaughter's illness would take her life sooner rather than later. Dan felt a wave of anger and helplessness surge through him. He had to do something. He couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't live with himself knowing that he had the opportunity to help and failed to act. The rain began to fall harder, drenching him as he made his way to the van. His hands trembled as he fumbled with his keys, but he knew he couldn't hesitate. Josalind's life depended on it. Once inside the van, Dan sat for a moment staring at the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing. His thoughts were chaotic, but one thing was crystal clear. He had to get help. There was no way he could handle this on his own. He needed to contact the authorities to call for help, but he also knew that doing so would put him at risk. He was stepping into dangerous territory by intervening in this family's affairs. What if Chris had influence? What if his actions were swept under the rug? Dan didn't know the answers, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut that told him he was making the right decision. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. As he waited for the dispatcher to pick up, he tried to calm himself, but it wasn't easy. The urgency in his chest only grew with every second that passed. When the operator answered, Dan's voice was steady, but his emotions were raw. He explained everything as calmly as he could. The girl, her condition, the fact that she had been kept inside for who knows how long, and the obvious signs of neglect. He could hear the operator taking notes, asking follow-up questions, and confirming his information. But as he spoke, a growing sense of dread washed over him. What if the police didn't believe him? What if they thought he was just making up a story? He knew that he had to be persistent. He couldn't back down now. Jocelyn's life was on the line, and no matter what, he wouldn't let her suffer in silence. After the call ended, Dan sat in the van for a moment, listening to the rain as it pattered against the windshield. He was on edge, waiting, wondering how long it would take for help to arrive. But he didn't have much time. He couldn't just wait around. He had to keep an eye on the house, on Jocelyn. He knew the police would come, but how long would they take? Would they even listen to him? His stomach churned with uncertainty, but he knew there was no turning back now. The wheels were in motion, and he had done the right thing. Now all he could do was wait and hope. As the minutes dragged by, Dan felt like he was suffocating in the van. The rain continued to pour, the sound almost deafening as he stared at the mansion in the distance. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, hope, and uncertainty. Every movement he saw from the mansion made his heart race. Was someone coming to check on Jocelyn? Were the police already on their way? Or was he just sitting here watching as time slipped by, doing nothing to help? His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. His heart skipped a beat as he saw a police car pull up in front of the mansion. A sense of relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a cold knot of anxiety. The officers got out of the car and walked up the front steps, and Dan could barely make out their conversation from where he was parked. His eyes were fixed on the front door, watching closely, hoping they would find the same thing he had: the signs of neglect, the sickness in Jocelyn's eyes, the cruel indifference from Chris. He waited, every second feeling like an eternity. He was desperate to know what would happen next, but he didn't dare approach. He was just a gardener. What could he do? He had already gone against Chris's wishes by involving the authorities, and now, all he could do was wait. The rain began to lighten, but the chill in the air still hung heavy, matching the feeling in his chest. He wanted to believe that the officers would take his claim seriously, but what if they didn't? What if Chris somehow convinced them that everything was fine, that he was just being a concerned, overzealous employee? He couldn't shake the doubt that gnawed at him. Was this all a mistake? Was he risking everything for nothing? The longer he sat there, the more he began to second-guess himself. But then, through the front door of the mansion, he saw Chris. The sight of him calm and collected, talking to the officers with a smile on his face, made Dan's blood run cold. He couldn't hear their conversation, but the way Chris stood there so composed made Dan's stomach turn. Chris was either very good at hiding the truth or was just that manipulative. It was then that Dan realized how much danger Jocelyn was truly in. Chris wasn't just hiding her illness, he was controlling her, using his power to keep everything under wraps. And no matter how much Dan wanted to believe that justice would be served, the reality was that wealth and influence had a way of making problems disappear. It wasn't just a matter of helping a sick child anymore. This was about standing up against someone who had everything to lose. And Dan knew, deep down, that if he didn't keep pushing, no one would ever help Jocelyn. The weight of that truth hit him harder than anything else that day. He couldn't stop now. He had to make sure Jocelyn's voice was heard no matter the consequences. The waiting felt like an eternity, and Dan's anxiety only deepened as he watched the officers leave the mansion, chatting and laughing with Chris. The way they interacted made him sick to his stomach. He had expected some kind of urgency, a sign that they had seen something, that they were taking action. But instead they looked relaxed, almost amused, as if the situation was no big deal. He couldn't believe his eyes. Jocelyn's life, her suffering, was being dismissed by the very people he had called for help. His hope began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of helplessness. What had gone wrong? Hadn't they seen what he had seen? Didn't they hear the same story he had told them? He felt his hands tremble on the steering wheel as the police officers walked past him, not even sparing him a second glance. They told him everything was fine, that the girl was fine, and that his accusations had been a misunderstanding. Dan's mind raced, but his body felt like it was frozen in place. He wanted to scream, to run after them and beg them to listen, but something told him it would be pointless. The system, the authorities, they were all too willing to turn a blind eye to the truth. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he watched them drive away. He couldn't believe it. He had just witnessed a miscarriage of justice, a failure that could cost Josalind everything. But something inside him snapped. He knew he couldn't give up, not when she was still out there, suffering. He couldn't let her be trapped in that mansion, with no one to help her, no one to care for her. Dan had made a promise to himself years ago after losing his own daughter, that he would never stand by and do nothing when someone else was in need. The memory of his daughter, the pain he had felt watching her suffer, burned like a fire inside him. He couldn't just walk away, knowing that Josalind was in danger. He had seen the signs. He had heard the fear in her voice, and he wasn't about to let her become another statistic. He couldn't fail her like he had failed his own child. And so, with a deep breath and a determined heart, Dan made the decision that would change everything. He was going to take matters into his own hands. It wasn't the right thing to do, he knew that. But it was the only thing he could do. He wouldn't let Josalind's cries for help go unheard. She needed him, and he would find a way to get her the help she deserved. He wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. Dan's heart was racing as he made the decision to act. He knew it wasn't the right thing to do. But the longer he thought about it, the clearer it became that he couldn't sit back and watch Josalind suffer. He couldn't live with himself knowing that he had the power to help her and chose to do nothing. As he parked his van just outside the mansion's gates, he quickly surveyed the area. His mind was running a mile a minute, trying to figure out the best way to get Josalind out of there. He knew that if Chris caught him, he would lose his job, possibly even face legal consequences. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting Josalind stay in that house, was far worse. He glanced at the mansion and the security cameras that monitored every inch of the property. It was risky, but he had no choice. If he didn't act now, he might never get another chance. He opened the van door and stepped out, the rain having lightened to a drizzle. His steps were deliberate, but every part of him was tense. As he approached the mansion, he couldn't help but think back to his own daughter and the pain he had gone through when he had lost her. The memories of hospital visits, the endless nights of worry, the helplessness of watching her fade away. Those feelings came rushing back with a vengeance. He had promised himself that he would never let another child go through what his daughter did without at least trying to make a difference. He made his way to the back of the mansion, staying low and as quiet as possible, praying that he wouldn't be seen. His mind raced as he thought about what he was doing. He was crossing a line, a big one, but in his heart, he knew it was the only thing he could do. As he reached the window where he had seen Josalind earlier, he hesitated for a brief moment. Could he really go through with this? But then he saw her, standing at the window again, her face pale, her eyes still hollow. She looked like she had given up, and it broke his heart all over again. This time, there was no going back. Dan picked up a rock from the flower bed, his fingers tight around it. With one swift motion, he threw it at the window. The glass shattered with a loud crash, and he winced at the noise, but there was no turning back now. He cleared the broken glass, grabbed the girl's hand, and pulled her through the window gently but urgently. Josalind didn't hesitate for a second. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was a spark of hope in them too. He knew he was doing the right thing. With her in his arms, he rushed to the back gate, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every step felt like it could be his last. He had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side, but he knew that Josalind would be safe in his arms. The world outside was dark and uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he was doing something right. As Dan carefully lifted Josalind over the fence and climbed over himself, he could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest, each breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He had done it. He had taken her out of that mansion, away from the only life she had ever known. But now what? He couldn't stop to think about it too much. They had to keep moving. He rushed to the van, quickly buckling Josalind into the passenger seat. His hands were shaking as he started the engine and pulled away from the mansion. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt thick with tension, as if the storm wasn't quite over yet. Josalind sat silently beside him, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. But there was also a glimmer of something else. Hope. For the first time in her life, someone cared enough to fight for her, and that made all the difference. As they drove, Dan knew he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What he had done was illegal, but in his heart, he knew it was the right thing. Jocelyn had suffered enough. She needed help, and he was going to make sure she got it. He pulled over to the side of the road and called 911 again, this time demanding to speak to a supervisor. He wasn't going to let the police dismiss this any longer. As the dispatcher listened to his frantic explanation, Dan could hear the urgency in their voice. He gave them the address of where they were parked, and within moments sirens were blaring in the distance. When the police arrived, Dan explained everything once again. But this time it was different. The officers listened, they believed him, and they took action. Jocelyn was taken to the hospital for a full evaluation, and Dan stayed by her side the whole time, just as he had promised. He didn't know what the future would hold for her, but for the first time in years he felt like he was doing something right. The road ahead was uncertain, but he had saved her, and that was all that mattered. In the end, Jocelyn got the medical care she needed, and the truth about her stepfather was uncovered. Dan's actions, although risky, had saved her life. And though the day had started as just another day of work, it ended with a feeling of peace and purpose he hadn't known in a long time. For the first time, he felt like he had truly made a difference. And no matter what happened next, that feeling would stay with him forever.